The Harper estate gleamed under the floodlights like a palace carved from cold marble and old money. Chandeliers glittered, cameras flashed, and laughter echoed through the opulent ballroom that smelled of champagne and the hunger for status. It was the kind of night where fortunes were flaunted and secrets were buried beneath silk gowns and tuxedo jackets. The gala was in full swing, a charity event that had little to do with charity and everything to do with reputation. But just as Douglas Harper raised his glass, basking in the applause of the media and the murmurs of admiration, the room fell abruptly silent. All eyes turned toward the grand staircase. She appeared at the top step without fanfare, without an announcement, without even a security escort. Naomi Sinclair Harper, tall, composed, radiant, in a gown of dark emerald satin that shimmered like it remembered a nobler time. Her curls were pulled back into a classic bun, a single strand falling elegantly down her cheek. Her skin glowed under the chandelier light, and her presence filled the space like a thunderstorm creeping in over calm water. People stared, and some of them whispered, not because they recognized her, but because they didn't. Douglas narrowed his eyes, barely able to believe what he was seeing. For a moment he didn't move. Then the corner of his mouth curled into a smug smile. He turned to the nearest guest and said in a half-mocking whisper, "Well, look who decided to show up." The laugh that followed was cold and intentional, echoing in the stillness like a challenge. Naomi descended the stairs one measured step at a time. Not hurried, not shy, as if the marble steps had been carved for her feet long before she'd ever mopped them. She didn't glance sideways. She didn't flinch at the stairs. And when she reached the ballroom floor, she paused just long enough to look Douglas directly in the eye. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't a plea. It was something more dangerous. It was indifference that knew its power. 3 days earlier, she had received a gold-trimmed invitation, hand-delivered by a snickering assistant who barely masked the contempt in his voice. "Mr. Harper thought you might enjoy the evening," he had said. "Dress code high society, hope you've got something that fits." The message wasn't subtle. It was a setup, a cruel joke intended to embarrass the woman who for 2 years had vacuumed their rugs, scrubbed their toilets, and faded into the background like she was part of the wallpaper. Naomi had smiled politely, said thank you, and closed the door. She sat quietly with the envelope in her lap for 10 minutes before walking to the closet where a garment bag hung untouched for years. Her mother's dress. A symbol, not of poverty or shame, but of memory of identity. The dress fit perfectly, as if the past had been waiting for this moment. Now here she was, standing not as a servant in uniform, but as a guest in command. The crowd tried to make sense of it. Patricia Delacroix, wife of Senator Delacroix, leaned in and hissed to her friend, "Is that the housekeeper Amanda Green snorted? I doubt she even owns that dress. Probably borrowed it. Or rented. 10 installments minimum." Naomi heard them. She heard everything. But she said nothing. Her silence was sharper than any reply. Douglas stepped forward, ever the showman, raising his glass again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with mock enthusiasm, "please welcome tonight's most unexpected guest, our very own Miss Naomi, who's been keeping this house spotless in ways we can all appreciate." The laughter that followed was harsher this time. Cameras flashed, trying to capture her reaction, to immortalize her humiliation. But Naomi didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and gave a small, serene smile, one that didn't reach her eyes but sent a chill through anyone looking closely. Then she said softly but clearly, "I appreciate the invitation, Mr. Harper, and I'm grateful to be here, though not for the reasons you think." The way she spoke made the room quiet again. Her voice was velvet-lined steel. Even Douglas hesitated. For the first time that evening, the laughter died, not because it had run its course, but because something in Naomi's gaze made them realize this was no longer a joke, and the night was just beginning. Douglas blinked, momentarily thrown off by the calmness in her tone. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't desperation. It was something far more dangerous: control. Naomi's words lingered in the air, like the faint scent of smoke before a fire. Guests shifted in their heels, their laughter now caught somewhere between confusion and discomfort. The orchestra paused between sets, and in the silence, the clinking of ice in cocktail glasses sounded almost obscene. Douglas forced a chuckle, the smirk on his face growing more brittle with each passing second. "Well," he said, voice straining for charm, "I hope you find this event Enlightening. It's not every day someone like you gets to mingle with New York's finest. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Someone like me, she repeated, her voice smooth as glass. Go ahead, Douglas. Finish the sentence. For a heartbeat, he hesitated. Something about the way she held his gaze, like she'd already mapped out every move he would make, made his confidence flicker. But he recovered quickly, straightening his shoulders and waving toward the crowd. Just meant you're not usually in this kind of environment. It must feel overwhelming. She smiled then, but not kindly. Overwhelming, number inconvenient, maybe. Mostly because I have to keep pretending this is your world. Her eyes swept the room slowly, deliberately. But let's not confuse polish with power. A few gasps broke through the room like cracks forming in glass. Even those who had been whispering behind champagne flutes were now holding their breath. Amanda Green, trying to salvage the awkwardness, stepped forward with a rehearsed grin. Naomi, darling, that dress is simply unexpected. Wherever did you find it? It must have taken weeks to find something so convincingly elegant. Naomi turned to her unblinking. Actually, it belonged to my mother. She wore it 25 years ago, right here in this very room. There was a shift in the air, a tremor beneath the velvet and gold. Patricia's brow furrowed. Your mother in this house? That's strange. I've been attending events here for decades. I don't recall, Naomi interrupted gently, but with unmistakable weight. Her name was Lillian Sinclair. She was a pianist, and for 5 years she was the private music tutor for William Harper. Her eyes flicked back to Douglas. Your father, gasps this time weren't subtle. They rolled through the crowd like a wave. Heads turned. Some guests took cautious steps back from Douglas. Others lifted their phones, realizing the night had turned into something much more than a gala. Douglas's jaw clenched. What are you insinuating? I'm not insinuating anything, Naomi said, her tone firm but unshaken. I'm stating a fact. Your father loved my mother. He supported her. And when she became pregnant with me, he promised to provide. He kept that promise until he died. And after that, someone made sure we disappeared. A vein twitched in Douglas's temple. This is absurd. You're spinning stories. There's no record of Naomi cut him off by reaching into her clutch. Slowly, calmly, she pulled out a small black box. Inside was a ring, elegant old, engraved with the Harper crest and crowned with a deep blue sapphire. This, she said, holding it up so everyone could see, was given to my mother by William Harper. It's the Harper engagement ring. You might recognize it, Douglas. You told the world your father died without an heir. But he didn't. He had me. A silence deeper than any before settled over the room. Douglas stared at the ring, his face draining of color. Patricia Delacroix whispered to her husband, "Is that true?" He didn't answer. No one did. The only sound was the low click of camera shutters and the rising heartbeat of a man watching his legacy unravel. And Naomi, still standing tall in the center of the room, had only just begun. Douglas opened his mouth, but no words came. The composure he had so carefully crafted over the years, the smug confidence, the polished charm, was cracking. He looked at the ring again, then at Naomi, as if trying to will her out of existence. But she stood there unshaken, the very image of quiet fire. Anyone can buy an old ring. He finally snapped, the tremor in his voice betraying his panic. This doesn't prove anything. You could have stolen it. Naomi didn't flinch. You can't steal something that belongs to you by blood. Whispers rose again, not just from the guests, but from the staff, lining the room's edges, the servers, the photographers, the string quartet frozen mid-rest. The room wasn't watching a scandal unfold anymore. It was watching a reckoning. From the main doors, a quiet commotion stirred. Naomi glanced over her shoulder and gave a small nod. At her cue, 3 people entered: a silver-haired man in a navy suit, a younger man carrying a leather briefcase, and a woman with a press badge pinned to her blazer. The crowd parted instinctively as they moved forward. Douglas narrowed his eyes. Who the hell are they? Naomi took a slow breath. People who've kept quiet long enough. The silver-haired man stepped forward first. I'm Dr. Martin Elwood. I was your father's physician for the last 7 years of his life. Douglas's expression flickered. Martin, you retired after. After I was forced to sign a falsified death certificate, the doctor cut in, his voice steady, despite the weight of his words. Your father didn't die of natural causes. He was slowly poisoned. Over a period of several months. Gasps echoed like thunder. One woman dropped her wine glass. The sound of it shattering barely registered over the wave of stunned reactions. That's a lie, Douglas shouted. You're lying. The woman with the press badge raised her hand calmly. I'm Celeste Moreno, senior journalist at the National Ledger. This entire event is being documented. Dr. Elwood's statement is on the record, and we have lab results to back it up. Naomi stepped forward, locking eyes with Douglas. He was going to amend the will, formally include me. He told my mother he had already signed it. He had it notarized. But before it was ever filed, he died. Conveniently. And right after that, every trace of our existence was erased. The man with the briefcase finally opened it, removing a folder. David Chun, he said, addressing the room. Estate and inheritance attorney. This, he held up a document, is the original will. We obtained it from a private notary. It names Naomi Sinclair Harper as a legal beneficiary. 50%. A wave of murmurs surged again. Douglas's hands balled into fists. That will isn't valid. It was never filed. It didn't need to be, Chun replied. The notary's seal and your father's signature are enough for probate court. Douglas took a stumbling step back. You planned this. Naomi nodded once. I applied to work here 2 years ago. I cleaned your floors while collecting every piece of truth you buried. I cataloged every lie, every signature, every silence. I didn't do this out of vengeance. I did it for my mother, for my father, and for every person like us that men like you thought could be discarded. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was thick, reverent, charged with the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. Then Naomi added softly but clearly, You tried to erase me, Douglas. But tonight the only thing being erased is your mask. Douglas staggered backward, as if Naomi's words had landed like a physical blow. He opened his mouth again, searching for a clever retort, a smirk, a lifeline, anything to salvage the crumbling illusion he had lived inside for years. But nothing came. Just the hush of a room watching the mighty unravel. Celeste stepped forward holding her phone. There's more, she said, gently but firmly. We have recordings. Conversations between Dr. Elwood and Douglas Harper, recorded without his knowledge after the doctor became suspicious. No, you can't, Douglas began, but Naomi was already raising her phone toward the sound system. Her fingers moved steadily as if she'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her head. A click, and then his voice boomed through the speakers. If you open your mouth about anything strange you found in his blood, you'll never work as a doctor again. And as for that woman and her bastard daughter, they'll get nothing. They'll disappear. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Helena Harper Douglas's wife turned pale. She took an instinctive step away from him, one hand pressed to her mouth. Her eyes locked on Naomi across the room, not with hatred, not even shock, but with something like guilt. Or maybe shame. Douglas's voice cracked through the speakers again. Delete everything. There is no daughter. There is no ring. There is no damn will. The audio stopped. No one moved. No one dared. Naomi let the silence breathe, stretch, settle like dust over the ballroom's polished grandeur. Then she spoke low, calm, unwavering. That voice is who you are. Not the tuxedo. Not the Forbes cover. That voice is the man who killed our father and made me clean his blood off your hands for 2 years. Douglas's knees buckled slightly. His arrogance had slipped from his face entirely, leaving only fear. Helena finally found her voice. Douglas. Is this true? She whispered. You told me your father died of heart failure. You told our children. He turned to her hands, trembling. Helena, please no. She took another step back. Don't say my name. Naomi looked at her, then at the others. You all laughed when I received the invitation, she said, not with bitterness, but with clarity. You watched me clean your glassware and sweep your marble floors. You assumed I had no story, no history, no right. David Chun stepped forward again. Under federal law, when foul play is discovered in connection with a will, all current claims are frozen. Assets will be reassessed, and I don't care about the money. Naomi interrupted, her eyes still on Douglas. I care about truth, about what was stolen, about what was silenced. From the back of the room, a voice small, almost hesitant spoke. Is she really his daughter? All eyes turned. Patricia Delacroix stood frozen beside her husband, tears barely visible at the corners of her heavily painted eyes. Naomi answered softly, Yes, I am. And you knew something was wrong. You all did. You saw how I was treated, and you laughed because it was easier than facing what your world does to women like me. Then the doors opened again this time, not for lawyers or journalists, but for uniformed officers. The sound of their boots echoed across the marble as they approached Douglas. He tried to step back, but his legs refused to obey. A single tear slipped down his cheek as the first cuff locked around his wrist. Naomi didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply watched as justice finally quietly arrived. And for the first time in 20 years, she felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. Not all the way, not yet, but enough to breathe again. As the officers led Douglas through the grand double doors, flashbulbs erupted outside like a war zone of truth crashing through privilege. Reporters swarmed the entrance, their voices slicing through the night air, demanding answers, firing questions, already rewriting the narrative they had once accepted without question. Inside, the ballroom remained suspended in stunned silence. Naomi stood motionless, not triumphant, but centered, grounded. There was no victory dance, no raised fists, only the quiet echo of justice finally catching up. Helena had moved to a corner away from the crowd, her hands shaking as she fumbled with her phone. Naomi watched her for a moment before turning away. She had no intention of humiliating Helena. That was never the point. Some people were victims of silence too, just in a different way. David Chun, now standing near the center of the room, pulled a document from his briefcase and handed it to Naomi. This is the official motion to reopen the Harper estate under suspicion of will tampering and murder. Probate court will begin the process of redistributing all assets. According to the notarized original, you are entitled to 50% ownership of Harper Media. Naomi took the paper without fanfare. She didn't look at the signatures. She already knew they were real. A few guests began to leave their heels clicking like gilt on polished stone. Others remained stuck in place by the weight of their own complicity. The same people who once offered Naomi orders and condescension were now looking at her with a different kind of reverence, uneasy, unfamiliar. Some stepped forward unsure of what to say. Patricia Delacroix was among them. Naomi, Patricia said carefully, her voice softer than before. We had no idea. Naomi turned, her expression unreadable. You didn't need to know. You just needed to care. Patricia froze. There was no venom in Naomi's tone, but there was no invitation either. Just the truth, bare and uncomplicated. As the guests dispersed, the projection screen remained lit with the documents, emails, transfers, every piece of evidence Naomi had gathered during her 2 years behind the scenes. She had built a quiet fortress of facts, not for revenge, but for revelation. She stepped outside onto the balcony, the cold air biting through the silk of her dress. Beneath her, the city pulsed with 1,000 stories, most of them hidden, most of them ignored. A cameraman caught sight of her and raised his lens, but Naomi turned away. Tonight was not about spectacle, it was about closure. A few minutes later, Helena stepped onto the balcony, her coat wrapped tight around her eyes, red and distant. I didn't know, she said. I swear I didn't. If I had, Naomi interrupted gently, I believe you. Helena looked at her stunned. You do, yes, Naomi said, but believing doesn't undo the harm, and it doesn't make you innocent. Helena nodded slowly. What happens now? Naomi looked out over the horizon. Now, we rebuild. We remember. We start telling the truth. The silence between them wasn't hostile. It wasn't warm either. It was the silence of two women standing at opposite ends of a storm they both survived in very different ways. Later that night, Naomi returned to the small apartment where she had lived since moving to the city. The dress was carefully folded, placed back into the garment bag as if returning a sacred artifact to its shrine. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked around a space once filled with restraint, now humming with quiet transformation. She picked up an old photograph of her mother at the piano, fingers poised above the keys, eyes closed in music. Naomi smiled for the first time that night, not because the war was over, but because the truth had finally been sung. And somewhere she hoped her mother was listening. 6 months later, the Harper Media headquarters looked nothing like it had before. Gone were the sterile white walls, the intimidating security desks, and the portraits of Douglas Harper gazing down like a monarch surveying his subjects. In their place were warm tones, framed photos of employees, real people being honored for their work, and quiet corners filled with books light and green. The building breathed differently now. It felt like people mattered. Naomi walked the hallways with quiet purpose, her presence as natural as light filtering through high windows. She didn't take the executive elevator, nor did she demand silence when she passed. People greeted her with real smiles, not forced ones. Respect born not of fear, but of recognition. In just half a year under her leadership, the company's profits had risen by 40%, not because she chased money, but because she dismantled the culture of fear and replaced it with fairness. Promotions were now based on merit, wages had increased, and flexible schedules made space for humanity. Her office, formerly Douglas's, had been completely redone. No longer dark and intimidating, it was now filled with sunbooks and family photos. A small framed picture of her mother sat near her computer, and next to it, 2 hand-drawn cards from the girls Naomi had recently adopted. 2 sisters, both under 10, rescued from a group foster home in Brooklyn. They had no family left. Now they had each other and her. That afternoon, Amanda, once a janitor in the same building, knocked gently on Naomi's door. Now Naomi's executive assistant, Amanda, had gone from cleaning floors to managing meetings for the CEO, all because someone had finally seen her potential. "Forbes is here," she said, smiling. "They're waiting in conference room A." Naomi rose, smoothing her blouse, then glanced at the framed quote on her wall, something her mother once told her: "Survival is strength, but kindness, that's power." She stepped into the room with the same quiet command she had brought into the ballroom 6 months before. The journalist stood to greet her, surprised by Naomi's approachable energy. "Before we start," the woman said, setting down her recorder, "I want to say what you've done here is extraordinary." Naomi nodded, appreciative but measured. "I didn't do it alone. I just cleared the way for good people to finally rise." The interview moved quickly. Questions about the company's transformation, her leadership style, her refusal to chase revenge. At one point, the journalist leaned in, curious. "Some people say what you did to Douglas Harper was too cruel, that you could have taken him down quietly. What do you say to that?" Naomi paused for a long time, then answered with a softness that held no apology. "Cruelty would have been doing to him what he did to us. Cruelty would have meant destroying him in the dark. Justice," she said carefully, "is bringing truth into the light and making sure it never happens again." The journalist blinked, then slowly nodded. "And what would you say to someone who's been wronged, who's been silenced like you were?" Naomi looked out the window. Below, employees gathered in the garden courtyard, laughing over lunch. The building wasn't just running, it was thriving. "I'd say this," she said, voice steady. "Don't waste your life trying to tear them down. Build something so powerful, so undeniable, that their cruelty becomes just the prologue. Your story is what comes after." That night back at home, Naomi tucked her daughters into bed, their tiny hands wrapped around stuffed animals she had picked out herself. One of them stirred eyes half closed and whispered, "Mommy, are you famous now?" Naomi smiled and kissed her forehead. "No, baby, I'm just free." And in that small, quiet apartment, filled with love and second chances, freedom had never felt more profound. On a quiet Sunday morning, the office sat still, washed in the warm glow of early light. Naomi arrived earlier than usual, her heels clicking softly across the polished floors. The building was mostly empty, save for the security guard who greeted her with the familiarity of an old friend, not a subordinate. She smiled back, nodding politely, then made her way to her office, coffee in hand and peace in her chest. It had taken months, but the chaos had settled. The media storm had passed. Douglas Harper had been sentenced to 25 years without parole, convicted on charges ranging from fraud to attempted murder. His name, once emblazoned across every surface of the Harper media legacy, had been quietly removed. The world moved on, but the ripples of his downfall still shaped conversations in boardrooms and newsrooms alike. Naomi hadn't sought out the spotlight. In fact, she declined most invitations for interviews and awards. She didn't want to be known for what she had survived, but for what she had built afterward. That distinction mattered deeply to her. Outside her office window, she could see the rooftop garden beginning to bloom. A project she'd launched months ago tended not by landscapers but by employees across departments. Finance tech editorial people who rarely saw one another now gathered to grow something real together. A small reminder that dignity, when shared, becomes its own kind of power. The letter came that morning, slipped in with the mail unmarked, unpretentious. Naomi recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Douglas. She hesitated before opening it. Her instinct told her to throw it away unread, but curiosity and something deeper closure perhaps persuaded her otherwise. Naomi, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know it's too late to undo anything I did, but I need you to know something. You didn't just destroy the man I became. You saved what little humanity I had left. My children ask about you. They want to meet the aunt who protected them when their father failed. If you ever decide to speak to them, I'd understand. If not, I'll never ask again. For what it's worth. Thank you. She read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. She didn't feel satisfaction, just stillness. Some wounds she had learned don't close with revenge or apologies. They close with truth, with time, and with a life rebuilt beyond the rubble. Later that week, she sat with Helena over coffee in a quiet cafe far from the office. Helena had moved to a different state with her children, seeking a fresh start. They talked not as enemies, but as women who had both survived the same storm, each in their own way. You could have destroyed us completely, Helena said softly, stirring her cup. But you didn't. You spared the kids. You spared me. I'll never forget that. Naomi looked at her calm and clear. Children don't deserve to pay for their parents' sins. They deserve the chance to be better. As they said goodbye, Naomi walked out into the street, the city humming with life around her. Her phone buzzed. It was her assistant reminding her that the scholarship fund launch was scheduled for tomorrow. The Harper Foundation had already funded dozens of students and launched support programs for domestic abuse survivors and underserved entrepreneurs. But tomorrow they were unveiling something new, a mentorship program for young girls who, like Naomi, once had felt invisible. That evening, she returned home just as the girls were setting the table. They ran to her, wrapping their arms around her waist, chattering about school and cartoons and chocolate chip pancakes. The noise, the joy, the normalcy, it filled her like nothing else. After dinner, Naomi stepped out onto the small balcony, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked up at the stars. Somewhere in the universe, her mother and father, two people who had once dared to love, despite the odds, were watching. She didn't need their approval, but she hoped they were proud. Because in a world that once tried to bury her in silence, she had become a voice that could not be ignored. And the best part, her story was no longer about what had been taken from her. It was about what she chose to give back. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Leave a comment and share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for watching and for believing that justice, dignity, and truth still matter.